Hey everyone, and welcome back to our class. This week we're talking about logical fallacies and cognitive biases. So there will be two videos, one on logical fallacies and one on cognitive biases, but there will only be one PowerPoint file, and it'll have both in it. So it's going to be kind of a loose structure because we're just going to go through some examples, and I'm going to talk about them. And we're going to talk about some of these specific fallacies and some of these specific cognitive biases. So this video is logical fallacies. So the first question is, what is a logical fallacy? Well, like cognitive biases, a logical fallacy is a sort of irrational mistake. If we want to be perfectly rational, then a logical fallacy is an error. It's not a rational inference or argumentative move, but we still make it sometimes. So we need to know what they are so we can watch out for them, so we can recognize them in others and recognize them in ourselves, so that we can sort of think more clearly and make fewer mistakes, so that we end up getting to the right conclusions, to the truth more often. So logical fallacies are our first topic. And logical fallacies are common errors in logic, and they make bad arguments. So if an argument commits a fallacy, then there's a problem with that argument. That argument does not provide the justification for its conclusion that it's supposed to, or that you would want it to. So an argument that commits a logical fallacy is called a fallacious argument. Fallacy is the noun, fallacious is the adjective. So logical fallacies are things that arguments have. Sometimes we say, like, a person commits a fallacy, like a person committed an ad hominem fallacy, or a person committed the gambler's fallacy. But what we mean is their argument, the argument they provided, or the line of thought that they followed, the sort of reasoning that they did, that was fallacious, that reasoning or that argument committed this fallacy. And so fallacies can sometimes be hard to notice, which is why they're so tricky and why we need to be careful about them. A fallacious argument can sometimes seem sound. It can seem like it's a valid argument. It can seem like all the premises are true. But the fallacy really hides the fact that it's not sound. It either the premises are false, but the fallacy sort of hides that or makes it harder to tell, or the argument is invalid and the fallacy kind of hides the invalidity or makes it look valid. So some of these fallacies, we can point to directly which of these, whether it's a false premise or a invalid inference, we can point to exactly the error that the fallacy makes. Some of them, like the gambler's fallacy, they just sort of are false moves themselves. It's harder to put those into arguments, like premise conclusion argument form. But if we want to make good arguments, and if we want to avoid accepting bad arguments, then we need to carefully recognize and avoid fallacies. We need to know what the fallacies are, and we need to avoid them so that we don't end up tricking ourselves or being tricked by other people into accepting false conclusions. So here's an example. This is just a comic I found on the internet. I thought it was funny, so it's in the slide. But I like the example. So there's a true thing. And the true thing is, if I tell the truth about everything, I will offend people. And that's true. Like if you, there are some people in the world who, if you tell them that the Confederate flag has a racist history, they will be offended by that. It's true. It does have a racist history. But if you tell them that, they'll get offended. Or even a less political, less whatever you want to call it example. If you tell your grandmother that you don't like the sweater she knitted you, you'll offend her. You'll be telling the truth maybe, but you'll offend her. So if you tell the truth about everything, like if you never tell the sort of little white lies out of politeness or anything, then you will offend people. That's a true thing. If I tell the truth about everything, I will offend people. So then some people fallaciously might infer, therefore, if I offend people, I must be telling the truth. And that's false. That's absolutely false. You can offend people by saying false things. You can say like bigoted falsehoods and offend people, and you are absolutely not telling the truth. You are saying false things, still offending people though. So if I offend people, then I must be telling the truth. That is a false thing. And the comic caption sort of punchline is that among scholars, this is known as the YouTube commenter's fallacy, because the YouTube comment section is an awful, awful place. But so you can easily infer, you can see how someone would make this mistake. If I tell the truth about everything, then I'll offend people. So I'm offending people, so I must be telling the truth. It's not, it is clearly a mistake. We should all be able to agree that is an error that this hypothetical YouTube commenter has made. But it's sort of a tricky error. It's switching the order of the if-then statement. That is a very common fallacy. You know, if you went to bed early, then you would wake up early. So you might infer from that, well, they woke up early, so they must have gone to bed early. But that's a bad inference. Yeah, if you go to bed early, you will wake up earlier, because no one sleeps for like 20 hours at a time. If you go to bed at 6 p.m., you're going to wake up early. But the fact that someone woke up early doesn't mean they went to bed early. You can go to bed at 2 a.m. and wake up at 4 a.m. That's life. So switching the order of the conditional is a sort of common and easy mistake to make, but it is still fallacious reasoning. So another more common example that I think is sort of, you don't need to have taken like a philosophy, logic, statistics type of course in order to be familiar with the gambler's fallacy. I think it's sort of more well known than some of these others we'll talk about. The gambler's fallacy is just a mistake that you might make if you're gambling. Thinking if you've had bad luck, then you're more likely to have good luck. Like, I've lost the last 6 hands of poker, so I'm due for a win. I'm bound to win this next hand because I'm due for a win. I've lost so many times in a row, I can't keep losing. I must be more likely to win this next hand. But that's a mistake. Each hand, statistically, is separate from all the others, assuming you're shuffling the deck all the time in between, yada, yada, yada. So if you lose 20 hands in a row at poker, or if you lose, say, 20 bets in a row, like maybe you bet on a horse race, maybe a roulette wheel. If you lose 20 times in a row, you might think that it makes you more likely to win, that you're bound to win. You're bound to win at some point. You've lost 20 times in a row, so you're sure to win the next one. But that's a fallacy. It comes from a sort of true thing. And that true thing is losing 21 hands in a row, or flipping a coin and getting heads 21 times in a row is really unlikely. But if you've already flipped the coin and it's landed heads 20 times in a row, it's still 50-50 whether or not you're going to hit heads on the 21st time. If you use a roulette wheel, and it lands on black 20 times in a row, it's still the same probability as the first roll that it'll land on black the 21st time. It might land on red, it might land on black. It's an even split. But it's easy to sort of get in the mindset of, well, for it to land on the same color 21 times in a row is really unlikely. So since that's probably not going to happen, it must be really, really likely that it's about to land on red. And that's just not true. That's a fallacy. The odds of losing any given poker hand, or the odds of the roulette ball landing on red, or the odds of a coin coming up tails, they're all exactly the same, regardless of what happened in previous hands, on previous rolls, on previous flips. They're every coin flip is independent. What happened on previous coin flips doesn't affect the next coin flip's odds or chances. Same for roulette wheels, same for poker hands. So it's a fallacy to think that the results of past hands will change the odds of current hands, of the current hand, or the current roll, or the current coin flip. Even if you flipped a coin 99 times in a row and it came up tails every time, it's still 50-50 whether or not it'll come up tails that 100th time. Because what happened on previous coin flips does not affect the current coin flip. So it's easy to get in that mindset because it's true that flipping a coin and getting tails 100 times in a row is really unlikely. But so was getting tails 99 times in a row. So once you've gotten tails 99 times in a row, whether you get 99 tails and then a heads or 100 tails, it's 50-50. Could go either way. The 99 tails have no impact on the odds of the 100th coin flip. So that's a gambler's fallacy. It's just an easy sort of error to make, but we can see it is a mistake. I don't recommend this. Please don't. But if you want to test it for yourself, try it. If you go gambling, you will find out pretty quickly when you lose your money that the gambler's fallacy is a real thing and it can get you in trouble. So before you go gambling, you want to know that you're not going to commit the gambler's fallacy. All right. Another fallacy is called the ad hominem fallacy. The ad hominem fallacy is also sometimes referred to as an ad hominem attack, because the way the ad hominem fallacy works is you attack the person who holds a view or makes a statement rather than critiquing the argument that the person made, or rather than providing an argument against the view itself. So instead of arguing against the view, giving reasons to think that a certain claim is wrong, you just give reasons to think the person who made the claim is bad. But that's a fallacy, because bad people can say true things sometimes. Broken clocks right twice a day and that kind of thing. So an example that you will hear, I've certainly heard, is Hitler instituted gun control. Therefore, gun control is bad. Which is an ad hominem fallacy, because we all agree Hitler, bad person, terrible person. But our main moral issue with Hitler is not the gun control. So compare that to Hitler thought that smoking was bad for your health. Therefore, smoking is good for your health. Just as a weird historical fact, I don't know why this would ever come up in your day-to-day life, but as a weird historical fact, the first ever government-funded public health anti-smoking campaign was in Nazi Germany. So the Nazis knew that smoking was bad for your health. The Nazis were bad. They're terrible, terrible people, terrible government, morally reprehensible. We all agree on that. But the fact that morally reprehensible people thought smoking was bad for you, that does not mean that smoking is good for your health. In fact, smoking is bad for your health. It causes cancer and all other sorts of issues. So thinking that, okay, Hitler thought smoking was bad for your health, therefore smoking is good for your health, that's an ad hominem fallacy. It's attaching this view to a bad person who supports it and then attacking that person rather than attacking the view, right? So that's an ad hominem fallacy. What we want to do in philosophy is not attack people. We want to attack views. Sometimes even philosophers who are professional philosophers will fall into this sort of issue, talking about Kantian ethics or utilitarian ethics. They'll talk about whether or not Kant lived up to the moral standards he proposed, or whether John Stuart Mill lived up to the utilitarian ethical standards that he proposed. And that's an interesting historical question. But even if Kant and Mill were moral failures by their own rights, or by their own lights, by their own views, that doesn't mean that the moral views they put forward were wrong. It means they failed to live up to them. But that doesn't tell us whether or not they're the right standards to try to live up to. So the ad hominem fallacy is very easy to make, so you need to be careful. If you find yourself talking about the person who made an argument or the person who stated the view, you're probably going to fall into, you either already have or you're about to fall into an ad hominem fallacy. So you want to be really careful. You want to catch yourself. Just as a sort of fun pop culture example, in the movie Pirates of the Caribbean, the original one, none of the sequels, I haven't seen those, but the original one, one of the British Navy officers asks, "Why aren't we doing what Mr. Sparrow said?" And the captain, commander, commodore, whatever, the boss Navy person says, "Because it was Mr. Sparrow who said it." So they reject a plan. They reject the claim about what they should do now based on who said it. And as a result, they all get killed by zombie pirates. Spoiler, if you haven't seen a movie that came out 20 years ago. They all get killed by zombie pirates, which usually the stakes are not that high in an ad hominem fallacy. Usually, if you make an ad hominem fallacy, you don't then get murdered by zombie pirates. But it's still, that's a case in a movie of someone making an ad hominem fallacy, rejecting a claim because they don't like the person who made it, and then facing negative consequences for it. So we want to be careful. We want to avoid making ad hominem fallacies if we can. And another fallacy, a different fallacy, it's called a circular argument, which we talked a little bit about last week in the What is an Argument lectures and slides. Because when we talk about an argument being persuasive, how we don't just want valid and sound arguments, we want persuasive arguments, in the sense that you could, at least in theory, accept the premises before you've accepted the conclusion. One reason we want those sorts of arguments, one reason we want persuasive arguments, is to avoid circular arguments, to avoid the circular argument fallacy, or to avoid the question begging fallacy, which is a very closely related fallacy. So a circular argument uses the premise to support the conclusion, and uses the conclusion to support the premise. That makes a circle of support, but nothing outside the circle is supporting it. So it's begging the question in both directions. So to beg the question, an argument begs the question if the conclusion is one of the premises. So we talked about that. There was an example of that in the slides last week. But just for an example of a circular argument, if you say, look, the Earth is round, therefore the Earth is round. That's a circular argument. It's a really simple, basic one that no one would actually make that mistake. But it's a circular argument. The premise is that the Earth is round, and the conclusion is that the Earth is round. Some examples are a little more complicated, but if you look at an argument and you think that one of the premises is just restating the conclusion, then it's begging the question. That's begging the question. So circular argument begs the question in both directions. See, so if you imagine these two arrows here are arguments, one argument uses the premise to support the conclusion. The other argument uses that conclusion of the first argument to support the premise. So the two arguments just sort of switch premises and conclusions. And you get caught in this loop going back and forth between the two arguments. But you don't have any support for those two arguments. Accepting that pair of arguments, they support each other, but accepting that pair of arguments is unsupported. There's no reason to do that, or those arguments don't give you a reason to do that. So a classic example, someone says God exists because the Bible says he does, or we know God exists because the Bible says he does. All right, well, how do we know that what the Bible says is true? Because the Bible is the word of God, and God wouldn't lie. That's a circular argument. You have one claim, God exists because the Bible says he does, which is supported by the claim that the Bible is the word of God and God wouldn't lie. So the second claim here relies on the first, which is that God exists. But the first relies on the second to trust the Bible. So maybe God exists, maybe God doesn't exist. I don't have any particular concerns about what anyone's religious views are. But whether or not God exists, this is a bad argument. And you can have a bad argument for a true claim. You can have bad arguments for true claims or false claims. So this is a bad argument, right? This pair of arguments is bad. It doesn't provide any external support for either claim. And this is a circular argument, right? So that's a circular argument example. Circular argument is premise supports the conclusion, conclusion supports the premise, and it's just in this circle that never gives you any reason to accept either the premise or the conclusion. And that we want to avoid those because it's easy to get trapped in a circular argument that makes you yourself feel good. You feel like you're supporting your views, but you're not going to convince anyone else. And if you're wrong, you're just caught in the circle and you won't find out. So it's tricky. You can end up tricking yourself with a circular argument, which you don't want to do. So another fallacy, which sometimes is, it's harder. This is a fallacy that's harder to trick yourself with. This is more a fallacy used sort of when people are arguing in bad faith. This is the Strawman Fallacy. And the Strawman Fallacy is the fallacy of claiming that your opponent has more extreme views than they actually do, and then arguing against those sort of caricature views, those more extreme views, instead of arguing against your opponent's actual views. And you'll see this a lot in politics. If you watch political debates on TV, you will see strawman fallacies. Doesn't matter what party you're looking at, doesn't matter if it's local, state, federal level, doesn't matter. You will see strawman fallacies because people are on stage for a couple minutes at a time, and it's just faster and easier to reject straw men than it is to reject actual views. So here's an example. Democrats want to turn our borders into a flood of deadly drugs and ruthless gangs. Here's another example, just so we get both sides. Republicans won't be satisfied until all poor people are starving in the street. Those are based on real things I've heard actual politicians with elected offices say. Now, clearly, both of these claims are false, right? No Republican politician is genuinely excited for poor people starving in the street as a goal. That's just not a thing. No, politicians are not that comically evil. Democratic politicians do not want to turn borders into a flood of deadly drugs and ruthless gangs. That's not their desire. That's not their goal. No one's that cartoonishly evil. That sort of caricature view is not actually being defended by anyone. But you will hear politicians accuse opponents of these sort of outlandish, crazy desires, like wanting poor people to starve or wanting deadly drugs to kill people in the country. Like, those are ridiculous views that no one actually holds. But if you can claim your opponent has those outrageous views, then you can argue against those outrageous views and know that the audience is on your side. If you say something, more nuanced and complicated, well, you might not have everyone on the audience on your side, so it's a little harder. But the straw man argument is not something you do when you're actually arguing in good faith, trying to get to the right answer and discuss ideas. It's performative. It's something you do to try to trick an audience into being on your side. And this is roughly how political debates work. Candidate 1 says, I like cats better than dogs. Candidate 2 says, my opponent hates dogs and thinks we should get rid of all dogs and replace them with cats, but I don't think we should do that. Right? And that's roughly how all political debates work, as far as I can tell, from having watched a couple dozen of them. And that's a straw man fallacy right there. One candidate says something fairly inane, like I'm a cat person. That's not actually what they talk about. What they talk about is like taxation and trade deals and stuff. But, you know, they say something fairly inane, like, I like cats better than dogs, and then they're immediately accused of saying that they hate dogs and think we should get rid of all dogs. And that's a straw man fallacy. That's not how we should be arguing. That is an error that politicians make because they're trying to get people to vote for them, and they don't have time to have real philosophical type discussions, so they have theatrical debates instead. So we don't want to do straw man fallacies. That's something people do when they're trying to trick an audience into agreeing with them. No straw man fallacies. Now, so that's straw man fallacy. Now, another fallacy is usually called false dichotomy or false dilemma. But the School of Thought Logical Fallacies poster that I sent out calls it black or white. Because basically what the false dichotomy or false dilemma or black or white fallacy does is it ignores all sort of shades of gray, all gray areas, and looks at it in two extreme absolutes when you actually don't have to do that. So the fallacy, the false dichotomy fallacy, is presenting two choices as if they were the only options, when really there are other options. So the false dichotomy fallacy is an argument with a false premise. And the false premise is that this A or B choice, that one of these must be true, when really that's not true. It might be that both of them are false and some third option is true. So it usually uses one of the following argument structures, which we talked about last week. So we have, on the left here, we have what's called disjunctive syllogism, but don't worry about that. That's jargon. You don't need to know. So the argument is A or B. So you have this choice between option A and option B. You say, all right, well, not B. Option B is false. Therefore, option A must be true, or A must be right. But if the A or B if premise one here is false, if there's a third option besides A or B, then A might not be right. There might be some option C, or maybe a C and D and E and F. Maybe there are lots of options that A or B just doesn't cover. And so A might not be true. So this argument is valid, but if the first premise is false, then it's not sound. And so the conclusion might still be false. The other argument structure is A or B, and if A, then C, and if B, then C. So therefore, either way, C. That's the Dalai Lama argument structure. Dalai Lama says there are two options. Either you can solve the problem or you can't. If you can solve the problem, there's no need to worry. If you can't solve the problem, then there's no help in worrying. So either way, you shouldn't be worrying, right? That's the Dalai Lama argument. Now, maybe there's a third option besides the problem you can solve or a problem you can't. Maybe there's a problem you can only solve if you worry about it a lot. I don't know what that problem would be. But if you think there's a third option there, then you think the Dalai Lama commits the false dichotomy fallacy in that argument. So false dichotomies often present two extreme choices. That's a lot of the times how they work, and that's why it's called the black or white fallacy. It avoids all the gray, it ignores all the sort of shades of gray, all the nuance in the middle, and just looks at the black and white extremes. So, example, either the government takes total control of the software industry, or we let companies like Apple and Facebook run wild and destroy democracy. And that's not true. There is a third option. There's a middle ground between the government having total control of an entire industry and letting Apple and Facebook run around in anarchy and destroy things. There's, moderate levels of regulation. So you can consider sort of another example. You can imagine someone saying, look, either the government watches everyone all the time to make sure they don't do anything wrong, or we let people run amok and kill each other all willy-nilly. No. And those aren't the only two options. Total anarchy or total 1984 George Orwell totalitarianism are not the only two options. There's a middle ground, like the society we live in which the government is not constantly watching you all the time, but you can't just run around killing people without consequences either. It's not anarchy. It's not totalitarianism. It's right there in the middle somewhere. Most political debates are about where in the middle we should be. Almost no one thinks we should be full anarchy or full totalitarianism. Another example, and this is, this is a direct quote from George W. Bush, but I don't intend this to be like a political thing. This is just a historical example. You're either with us or you're against us. And George W. Bush is not the only person to have said this. This sentiment has been expressed many times by many people in many different scenarios. But you're either with us or you're against us. That's a false dichotomy. There's an option besides ally or enemy, and that option is neutral, indifferent, outside. Switzerland's been neutral in almost every war for hundreds of years now. They were neutral in World War II. So was Ireland. You don't have to be an ally or an enemy. You can be neutral. So to say you're either with us or you're against us is a false dichotomy. It leaves out neutrality as an option. It insists on a false dichotomy of either ally or enemy, and that there's no middle ground, when in fact, there is middle ground. Right? So that's a false dichotomy fallacy. This other fallacy is called affirming the consequent. And this is a very common fallacy that I think we should talk about because it's common, it's easy to make. We all do it sometimes. I do it sometimes, you do it sometimes, we all do it sometimes. There's a lot of evidence, like a worrying amount of evidence in cognitive science, that people just really, on some unconscious level, really like affirming the consequent. It's a really easy fallacy to make that people do just sort of at a drop of a hat. And it's very similar to the YouTube commenters fallacy that we talked about on an earlier slide. So affirming the consequent as a fallacy is any argument of the following form. If A, then B. It's premise one. Premise two is B. And the conclusion is therefore A. If A, then B. B, therefore A. So we can rephrase the YouTube commenters fallacy so it's an instance of affirming the consequent. So someone thinks, all right, if I tell the truth about everything, then I will offend people, right? And that's true. That's premise one. Premise two is I am offending people. That's premise two. Conclusion. Therefore, I must be telling the truth about everything. Right? That's clearly a bad argument. That's fallacious. That is a fallacy. And that is affirming the consequent. So you have a conditional, if A, then B. If I tell the truth about everything, then I offend people. And then B, the second premise is the right side of the conditional, the then statement of the conditional, not the if statement of the conditional, the then statement. So B, I am offending people. And then you conclude A, the if clause, the if statement in the conditional. A, I must be telling the truth all the time about everything. And that's a fallacious argument. That's a bad argument. So it looks a lot like modus ponens and modus tollens, which are arguments we talked about last week. Feel free to go back and check the video or check the slides if you want a refresher on those. Affirming the consequent looks a lot like modus ponens and modus tollens. If you just sort of look at them schematically with like A and B standing in for any actual claims, it's hard to tell which one's right, which one's wrong. But modus ponens and modus tollens are valid, and affirming the consequent is not valid. Right? If you take this argument and you replace B with A, then it would be modus ponens and it would be valid. replace premise 2 with A and replace 3 with B, then it would be modus ponens and it would be valid. Or replace premise 2 here with not B, with the claim that B is false, and replace the conclusion with therefore not A, or therefore A is false, then you'd have modus tollens, and that would be valid. But as it stands, this is not a valid argument. So here's an example of affirming the consequent. If you have a dog, then you have a pet. Right? That's a true claim. If you have a dog, then you have a pet. Dogs that people have are pets. There are wild dogs, there are stray dogs, not all dogs are pets, but if you have a dog, then that dog is a pet, and therefore you have a pet. So this premise 1 is true. If you have a dog, then you have a pet. Premise 2, Susan has a pet. Therefore, Susan has a dog. Right. Now that is affirming the consequent. And that is a fallacious argument. So we can ask, is it valid? Is it possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false? No. No, it is not. So, looking at the argument again, suppose Susan has a cat and no other pets. Well, then premise 2 is true, and premise 1 is obviously true, but the conclusion is false. Susan doesn't have a dog. She has a cat and no other pets. So the argument's not valid because the premises can be true and the conclusion can still be false, even if the premises are true. So we don't want to affirm the consequent. It looks like a valid argument, but it's not a valid argument. So affirming the consequent is not valid, but it sometimes looks valid. So here's an example, and this is not in premise, conclusion, numbered statement form. This is just sort of conversational form, I guess you'd call it. Whenever you have coffee after dinner, you're up all night, and you were up all last night. So you must have had coffee after dinner last night. Why would you have coffee after dinner last night? You know it keeps you up, yada, yada. Right? That is a form of affirming the consequent. Whenever you have coffee after dinner, you're up all night. That functions just like if you have coffee after dinner, then you're up all night. The whenever statement works just like an if-then statement. If you have coffee after dinner, then you're up all night. And you were up all night last night. So you must have had coffee after dinner. But that's not true. You may have been up all night last night because you were worrying, or because you had slept in really late that day, or you took a nap late in the afternoon, or you had a lot of work to do and you had to pull an all-nighter to get the work done. There are lots of possible explanations for why you were up all night. Maybe it was for fun. You were hanging out with people. There are lots of reasons to be up all night besides having had coffee after dinner and the caffeine keeping you awake. So this example here with having coffee after dinner is based on a real conversation that I've had in real life. So I know this can happen. It's easy to make this mistake. People make it. But it's still a fallacy. It's still an error. So we want to be careful and try to avoid it whenever we can. All right. So here's another fallacy. This is called equivocation usually, but the School of Thought Logical Fallacies poster calls it ambiguity. So the equivocation or ambiguity fallacy is using a word or phrase with two different meanings and pretending that they have the same meaning, that both occurrences of the word or phrase have the same meaning in the argument. So it's easier to look by example. So here's an example. All politicians are snakes. You know, snake is a metaphorical term meaning someone who's like sneaky or untrustworthy, who will bite you, turn around and bite you after you've helped them or whatever. It means sneaky, basically. So all politicians are snakes. Snakes have no legs. That's true. Snakes, as an animal, as a kind of reptile, they don't have legs. Therefore, politicians have no legs. Now, if we look at this argument and we pretend that the word snake has the same meaning in premise 1 and in premise 2, then this is a valid argument. All politicians are snakes. Snakes don't have legs. Therefore, politicians don't have legs. It's just like it's similar to the Richard Nixon thing. Richard Nixon is a polar bear. All polar bears are blue. Therefore, Richard Nixon is blue. It's a very similar structure, but this is a valid argument if we pretend that snake has the same meaning in premise 1 and premise 2. But as a matter of fact, it doesn't. It's literal, referring to a kind of animal in premise 2, and it's metaphorical, calling people sneaky in premise 1. So you might think that all politicians are snakes in the sense that they are sneaky, and you might think that snakes have no legs because that's just a true fact about animals. And so if we pretend snake has the same meaning in both cases, then the premises are true and the argument's valid, and so we have to conclude that politicians have no legs. But that's not true. Many politicians do have legs. Some don't, but most do. So that's a fallacy. It can make it look like the argument is sound, like both premises are true and it's valid. But in fact, it's not valid because the word is being used differently in the two premises. Here's another example. It's impossible for two objects to be separated by a vacuum. For if a vacuum is to separate them, then nothing can be between them. But if nothing is between them, then they obviously aren't separated. Right. So this is an argument for the claim that two objects can't be separated by a vacuum. Like, for example, in the vacuum of space, that it's impossible for the Earth and the Sun in space to be separated by a vacuum, for there to be a vacuum, the vacuum of space, in between them. And the argument is, well, look, if a vacuum is to separate them, then nothing can be between them, because if there was nothing between them, or if there was something between them, if like there was air between them or water between them, then there wouldn't be a vacuum. Instead of a vacuum, you'd have air or water. Right? But so if they're separated by a vacuum, then there's nothing between them. No air, no water, no nothing. And that's true. If there's stuff between them, like air or water, then there's no vacuum there. So if two objects are separated by a vacuum, then there's nothing between them. And that's true. That's a true premise. But if nothing is between them, then they obviously aren't separated. And that is also true using a different meaning of the word nothing. If you say there's nothing between them in a way that includes space itself, there's no space between them, then they aren't separated. They're adjacent. They're side by side. And so this might look like a valid argument. If a vacuum is separating two objects, then there's nothing between them. But if there's nothing between the objects, then they're not separated. Therefore, it's impossible for a vacuum to be separating two objects. Right. And so this might be a little clearer in a premise conclusion. So, if a vacuum separates two objects, then there's nothing between them. If nothing is between them, then they obviously aren't separated. Therefore, two objects cannot be separated by a vacuum. It's impossible for two objects to be separated by a vacuum. And this is an example of equivocation. And it's an equivocation on the phrase nothing between them. In premise 1, nothing between them means no air or objects or water or substance in the space between them. And in 2, the premise 2, it means no space or distance between them. So this is a seemingly valid argument. It looks valid, and it looks like the premises are true. So it looks like a sound argument, but it's fallacious, and the conclusion is in fact false. We know that there are objects separated by a vacuum, like stars and planets in space. So this equivocation between the phrase, or this equivocation on the phrase nothing between them, hides the invalidity of this argument. And that's a fallacy. Here's another example, an easier, clearer, more relevant to real life, probably, example. That is just the thing that someone showed me on the internet, and I liked it, so it's in the slide now. Sometimes people use the word respect to mean treating someone like a person. And sometimes they use respect to mean treating someone like an authority. Right? So the word respect has two meanings. There's respect in the sort of like show respect, like respect them as an authority, the way like someone in the military respects their commanding officer and salutes and things like that. But there's also to respect someone, to just respect them, to treat them as a person, to respect them as a human being, respect their rights and things like that. That sense of respect. Respect their boundaries, that kind of thing. So there are two meanings to the word respect. Treat someone like a person and treat someone like an authority. And sometimes people who are used to being treated like an authority say, if you won't respect me, I won't respect you. And what they mean is, if you won't treat me like an authority, then I won't treat you like a person. And they think they're being fair, but they aren't, and it's not okay. Right? So that is an example of equivocation. And it's an example of people, assuming they're speaking in good faith, making an error and tricking themselves with this fallacy. They think they're being fair when they say, if you won't respect me, I won't respect you. You know, if teachers or coaches or police officers or whatever, people who are used to having authority, if they say, if you won't respect me, I won't respect you, they might think they're being fair because it sounds fair. If you don't respect me, I won't respect you. It sounds like it's just two people mutually not respecting each other and that's it. It sounds fair, but it's not, because they're using the word respect differently in each case. They mean, if you won't treat me like an authority in that sense of respect, then I won't treat you like a person in the other sense of respect. And so it sounds fair, and the person saying it might think they're being fair, but it's not fair, and they're not being fair, and they may not even realize it. So that's an example of a fallacy, of the equivocation fallacy. And we want to avoid it because we want to be fair. We want to avoid making mistakes. And equivocating can lead you to make errors, to behave unfairly, to think something's right when it's not. And so we want to be careful and avoid the fallacy and make sure that we're using the word in the same way to have the same meaning every time we use it in an argument. All right, and so this is the last fallacy I want to talk about, and then we'll finish this video and move on to cognitive biases. So this fallacy is called the Fallacy Fallacy. And the Fallacy Fallacy is what happens when you reject a conclusion or decide that a conclusion must be false because it's defended by a fallacious argument. So the Fallacy Fallacy is someone makes a fallacious argument for a claim, and you conclude that their claim is false. Their conclusion must be false because their argument was fallacious. And this is a mistake because even true claims can have bad arguments. If you want an example, pick literally any true claim you can think of, right? Any true claim you can think of. Make that the premise and make it the conclusion. Boom. Question-begging fallacy, circular argument fallacy for a true claim. The conclusion's true, but the argument's fallacious. Very easy recipe right there. So that's an easy recipe, but there are other ways to do it. So as an exercise, you can try to come up with a fallacious argument for a true claim. Pick a sentence that's true and come up with an argument that either commits one of the fallacies we've talked about they're not either, that both commits one of the fallacies we talked about and has your true sentence as a conclusion. You can do that, maybe not with the gambler's fallacy because that's a different kind of fallacy, but you can do that with almost any of these fallacies. You can have an ad hominem attack for a true claim. You can have equivocation argument that gets to a true conclusion. You can have bad arguments for any claim. So just because an argument is bad or just because an argument commits a fallacy, that doesn't mean that the conclusion must be false. It means that argument doesn't give us a reason to think the conclusion is true. But whether or not the conclusion is true is not itself decided by the fact that there's a bad argument. Because you can make bad arguments for true claims. So we don't want to commit the fallacy. When someone gives us a fallacious argument, we don't want to say that argument was bad, you committed such and such fallacy, so you're wrong. We want to say that argument was bad, it commits such and such fallacy, so I have no reason to think you're right. And that's all. Sometimes it might feel better to make the stronger claim and say they're wrong, but you're not justified in doing that. The fact that the argument's bad doesn't justify you concluding that the claim itself is false. So we want to avoid that mistake. So it's a very easy mistake to make. All right. And that's the last fallacy. So now I'm going to close this video and we'll start a new video for cognitive biases. So I will see you in the next video.